Back to the book of Job this morning. It has been about a month since we last found ourselves in the book of Job. So this morning we're going to ease our way back into the book. It's, when you have a month of other types of preaching, you have a tendency to forget where you are. So let's go back and rehearse a bit of what we have seen already in this book. And I think it's necessary to get a running start into where we're going to be going in the weeks ahead. You remember this book starts off with a biography of Job. First 5 verses of the book are a telling of Job's life. We find that he is a wealthy man in terms of his material prosperity, but he is also a man committed to the worship of the living God. He even goes so far as to try to get his own sons and daughters to understand the reality of this. He makes sacrifice for them, you remember, after they have their little parties to make sure that they have not cursed the name of God. So he's a man committed to passing on the worship of God to his family. And then the story of, or the biography of Job is followed then by the first great heavenly council that we see in this book. And what we see in this first heavenly council is the purpose of God over the life of Job, and more specifically, the purpose of God over Job by declaration. See, when God says to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, a blameless and upright man who fears God and shuns evil?" He's not making an observation. Well, yes, it is true, it's an observation. But when God speaks, what he speaks isn't just observed. It is something that he is declaring to be true. And so he is saying to Satan, I want you to understand who this man is. God's purpose was to demonstrate through the life of Job that Job's nature as blameless and upright was predestined, purpose, preordained by God. That God had purpose for this man to be this, and more importantly, that nothing could change that. Nothing could change what God had established. What God speaks is, because God is God. Now, as I said, this is not a test of Satan. Okay. I know I called it that, but it's really not a test of Satan per se, nor is it some sort of examination about how we as Christians ought to deal with suffering. That's all subtext in this book. We often elevate it to being the primary point, but it's not. Rather, this is a book about a revelation of what it means to be ordained by God to his purposes. And that such reality is fixed by the sovereign plans of a holy God who purposes it. Says, this is what I have purposed. And so Satan is used by God. Satan becomes a means in the hands of a holy God, and the circumstances surrounding Job's life as well, to demonstrate that God's purposes cannot be altered by those things external to us who trust in God. When we put our faith and our trust in him, what God declares to be true and right and good cannot be altered by the circumstances around us. We think it can, and Satan thought it could. But God's making a point here. So he sends Satan out to attack Job, which is what Satan wants to do, by the way. Okay, so we can't blame this on God. This is clearly something that Satan wants to accomplish. And so Satan goes out from this council and he attacks. What does he do? Well, he attempts to destroy everything external to Job, every blessing that Job has. And he's trying to do so in the hope, I would say the vain hope, that would cause the true nature of Job to appear. See, the goal is to demonstrate that Job was not actually blameless. You see, Satan believed that Job's righteousness was based entirely on his physical blessings, those things present in his life, you see. And Satan said, see, if I just take all that stuff away, then who the true man is will show. You see, all I got to do is take away his means of agriculture, his means of transportation, take away his children, take away his servants, take away all the good things in his life, and watch what he'll do. He'll curse you, God. And so Satan believed that he could destroy Job's righteousness by virtue of changing his outward circumstances. But Job's response, you remember, was simply to shrug. The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Job says, look, all that we have from God, all that we have is from God anyways. And so God has every right to give it, and God has every right to take it away. So why should I complain if God takes away all of my blessings? That's God's intentions and purpose, so be it. The bottom line, as you see in verse 22 of chapter 1, the bottom line then of this first attack is that Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. The text tells us that Job maintained his trust in the promises of God outside of his circumstances. His circumstances did not change his trust, and that therefore validated the very purpose of God over him. You might say it like this: Satan went out and proved God's point. He proved it, at least once. Which leads to a second counsel that comes in chapter 2. Satan doesn't believe that was sufficient. And so another counsel is called. You'll notice that God makes exactly the same declaration over Job as he did the first time. He extends it even. And so it's another demonstration. The second counsel becomes another demonstration by God whereby Job's righteousness would still be vindicated. And in this case, still be vindicated even if Satan is allowed to attack the man himself. Because see, in the first counsel and in the first attack, it was just the external stuff. And so Satan's response is, well, skin for skin. Attack all of his outer stuff, take away all of his outer stuff, and the man just shrugs and goes, okay, so be it. But I tell you this is Satan speaking here, you attack the man, and that'll demonstrate who he really is. And God says, okay, you think so? You can do anything you want to, just don't kill him. And so God, once again, is going to use Satan as a means to demonstrate that his purposes cannot be thwarted, even if the man himself is laid bare by his circumstances. So out goes Satan again from the presence of the Lord. His continuing intention to cause Job to sin, and he removes Job's physical comfort, of course, by attacking his flesh. And he attacks his skin. It gives him some sort of sores all over his body. Now, I would have you note, as I pointed out in the sermon on that subject, that Satan only attacked him on the outer part of his body. He didn't give him cancer in his liver. He didn't attack his heart. He only attacked his skin, which I still find interesting. Skin for skin? Okay, right? So he attacks his outward physical nature, his outward flesh. His attack was only skin deep. His inner flesh was untouched. Only his outward covering. And the point that I made, you remember, is that Satan's attacks are always superficial. They're always superficial, okay? Satan does not have the ability to change the core of a man. He doesn't have the ability to change the nature of things. All he can do is attack the outer, which is what he did. He attacked the outer man in his attempt to try to get Job to sin. But Job's response was to bring sound theology, sound theological maturity to bear. He says this even to his wife, which, by the way, I'm convinced Satan sent in as an additional attack, right? Just curse God and die. Job's response is to bring some solid theological maturity. He says, look, how can we, who are sinners, receive good from God when we truly deserve nothing but misery? I mean, if we're going to be honest about this, we really deserve nothing but misery. How can we expect to receive good and not misery from God? The bottom line, again, verse 10 of the second chapter. Job did not sin with his lips. Again, he maintained his trust in God in spite of his misery. And what does this do? This validates again the preordained purpose of God over him. He demonstrates in his life what God has declared to be true. Satan cannot change it. Even in his misery, Job looks through bleary eyes at his wife and says, you sound like a foolish woman. Shouldn't we expect both good and evil from the Lord? Now, I want you to, I compress that together like that to bring before you a reminder, okay? There's a great reminder here that you need to remember. It's the importance of Job's response to what befell him, all right? If you look at chapter 2 and in verse 10, the end, when Job speaks, he says, you speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive, and the word that's now used is the word evil. Okay, the ESV uses the word evil here. Now, there's a footnote in the ESV that suggests other possible words here. In fact, the ESV suggests the possibility of disaster, right? And if you look at other English translations, the word is translated in things like adversity or trouble or even just bad as compared to good. Okay. But the underlying word that's used in the Hebrew here is the word ra, R-A, ra. It's a simple little word, and it's used 347 times in the Old Testament, okay? It's a Hebrew word which has a clear semantic domain. We know what this word means. It is most often used. In fact, 228 out of the 347 times it's used. It is used as a distinction from the concept of good. It's used as a distinction from the concept of good. I'll give you the best example of this in the Old Testament. In Genesis chapter 2 and verse 9, Adam is told that he is not allowed to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and ra, evil. There's a distinction that's made. Even Satan makes this distinction in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 5 when he says, oh, you will become like God, knowing good and ra, evil. The word itself doesn't mean just disaster or trouble or difficulty. It means evil. Or more specifically, that which is diametrically opposed to good. And where do we see that word? We see it all over Genesis 1, don't we? And God declared it to be good. Okay, you see it? This word isn't Job just saying, well, shouldn't we just expect trouble in our lives? Or shouldn't we just expect adversity in our lives? No. This is Job saying, listen, we can expect that which is good from God's perspective and that which is evil from God's perspective. Okay, so this is very important. I want you to understand this because the concept of evil is central to a biblical understanding of the world. Okay, make no mistake, this is right at the very beginning of human history when God plants a tree and calls it the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This is the reality of the world, okay? It is not just trouble or disaster that comes upon us. It is evil that comes upon us. It is evil that comes, which is contrary to what God himself calls good. And good, being corrupted, is evil. The opposite of good is evil, just as the opposite of perfection is corruption, imperfection, brokenness, etc. The opposite of good, as God himself is evil. Now, why do I say that? What came upon Job was pure evil. What came upon Job was pure evil. It wasn't just adversity, trouble, difficulty, tribulations, trials. No, it was pure evil. It's utterly contrary to all that is as good. And here's what I want you to think about. We who are followers of Christ, we who hold to a biblical worldview, should not be afraid to call evil what it is. Okay? We have a tendency to want to euphemize this word. Not euthanize, that's a different concept. Okay. Euphemize. We want to take this word and change it a little. We want, no, we don't talk about evil. No, we want to talk about just things being bad or difficult or troubling. No. If we're going to address what's happening in our world today, we must be willing to use the biblical terms that describe it. We are not looking at a world that's filled with just trouble. We are looking at a world filled with evil. The ideologies that are taking hold of our culture are not just bad, they are evil. They are contrary to God's good nature. And thus they are not just, oh, that's too bad. No, they are evil. They are wicked. When we euphemize away the true reality of what has befallen this world, here's what we do. We do two things. Number one, we denigrate the reality of what evil is. Okay, so now we don't really know what evil is anymore. But most importantly, if we fail to call evil evil, we diminish the work of redemption in Christ. The gospel's at stake here, my friends. The gospel's at stake. The very message of Christ isn't Christ coming into the world to try to fix a few social evils. Social ills. Okay? Because they wouldn't say social evils, would they? They would say social ills, right? So much of Christianity today is built around this idea of, well, Jesus just came into the world to solve a few of our social problems. He just wants us to relate better as races, and he wants to solve poverty issues by making rich people take care of poor people, and on and on and on and on and on it goes. And they purposely avoid the issue. And what's the issue? The issue is that this world has been overtaken by evil. That which is contrary to the nature of a holy God. And when we reduce, euphemize, or in some way minimize the issues that we're facing, we actually wipe out the gospel. Why did Christ really come? He came to redeem a people who are evil. We weren't just bad folks that did a few bad things and Jesus came along to rescue us. We were wicked. We were evil. We were contrary to all that is good in God. We hated him. We despised his law. We shook our fists at the heavens and said, I will not be what you will have me to be. And he rescued us. He brought good in his own son to bear against evil. You see, that's the gospel, my friends. That's the gospel. The gospel of Jesus Christ is not a message of, well, we just hope that, everything turns out good in the end. No. The message of the gospel is Christ has come and he has entered into a world of wickedness and evil, darkness and rebellion, and took upon himself that wickedness, that evil. The most evil event, the most wicked event that occurred in human history is when they nailed the Son of God to a cross. He bore that evil in order that he might solve a wickedness problem, an evil problem, you see. Job doesn't look at his wife and go, well, we should expect a little trouble, don't you think? No, he looks at his wife and he says, we live in a world that is evil. We should expect evil to come upon us. He calls it for what it is. Now, having said that, I would have you notice that twice in this narrative, two times, once at the end of chapter 1, once at the end of chapter 2, or at the end of the section we finished in chapter 2, that Job is said to not sin. See it? I called your attention to it twice because I really want you to notice this. It's in chapter 1:22 and chapter 2, verse 10. As I argued, Job maintains his status as a blameless and upright man even in the face of what befalls him. He looks at what has happened to him, the evil that has befallen him, and he does not sin. And this is the key to unlocking the rest of the book. Okay? Get that straight. The issue of this book is not about men arguing over what it means to suffer. This is about the issue, specifically the issue of sin and wickedness and what it means to either be a man who is wicked or to be a man who is righteous. That's the key. Job is a man who does not sin, and I believe that this carries on through the rest of the book. As Job's friends arrive and they begin to dialogue with one another, Job will continue to be a righteous man and maintain his state, even as his friends attempt to dissuade him of his position. Even as his friends attempt to dissuade him of his trust in God. So I would put before you the following assertions, which I believe are all true as we continue through this book. Number one, Job's friends honestly believe, they have the right motives, right? They honestly believe that they can comfort Job through this difficult time. They believe that they can come to him and bring him comfort, thinking that human wisdom, or maybe just their presence, is comforting in and of itself. That's true, but there's another truth behind that, and it's this. Job's friends are actually agents of Satan. His wife was. All the servants that came in to tell him all the trouble that he had were all being used as agents of Satan to attempt to change Job. Job's friends are being used by the devil to convince Job, or better, to leverage his faith away. They're not coming to comfort. Oh, I know they think they are. But in the end, they're going to wind up being tools in the hands of Satan. Now, I will add this, though, as Calvin himself said, that Job's responses to his friends, unfortunately, although certainly understandable in human terms, right, they seem to demonstrate that Job is unrighteous at times. Okay, so you're going to read through the rest of this book, and you're going to get the impression every once in a while that Job has veered off into unrighteousness. But don't be confused by that. They are more likely simply his flesh talking. Now, you know what that means, right? That's that outward nature of us that has this tendency to go back, running back to the old man every once in a while and thinking like the old man every once in a while. Even though, as Paul says in Romans 7, I know in my mind and in my heart what I ought to do, but in my flesh I wind up doing something else. Okay, that's probably the explanation here. No one would read Romans 7 and say, well, see, Paul was an unrighteous man. No, we would look at that chapter and what we would say. We would say, no, this is the guy who's struggling with these realities of the world. The struggle is not in and of itself sinful. So we need to be careful with that as we consider it. That's the remnants of the old man talking. In other words, as Calvin says, okay, here's what happens. Job's friends come and they speak of evil things well, and Job sits there and speaks of good things, well, rather poorly. Okay, that's the contrast that you see. But that doesn't change anything in terms of God's decree here. All of this, okay, all of chapter 3 to the end of the book, exception of the last chapter, is really just smoke and mirrors. Okay? You got to think like that. You got to remember that going in. Job did not sin. Twice the author tells us that. He wants you to think about that, not just in terms of what has already happened to him, but what will happen to him going forward. In other words, in the end, the only thing that really matters in all of this, the only thing that really matters is what God reveals as truth. That's the only thing that's going to matter. You and I can debate and argue about all these things all we want to, but it doesn't really matter. All that really matters is, what does God say? What is God's belief? What's his opinion? Because ours doesn't matter. Job's opinion doesn't matter. His friends' opinions doesn't matter. What matters is God's opinion. Oh, and he will get the last word, as he always does. And our true comfort in all of this is found in the concept of truth. Because if God speaks, it's true, right? What God says is true. Because God is good and God is true. And so when God speaks, what he says is true. And that, by the way, is our comfort. That's our comfort. In the midst of whatever happens to us, in the midst of whatever goes on around us, the true comfort we find in this world is truth from outside of this world. A revelation that comes from God who is not bound by time and space. A God who speaks from on high. It's the truth revealed by God, the source of all that is good in a fallen and sinful creation. Okay? So it's important for us to remember I said my introduction is going to be relatively long here, because we need to make sure that we keep track of what has taken place in these first two chapters as we go forward into these rather pedantic speeches that now come. So we start with Job's friends coming to comfort him, which is kind of what we'd expect them to do, right? So we come to chapter 2, verses 11 to 13. Here's what it says. Now, when Job's three friends heard of all this evil that had come upon him, correct translation, they came each from his own place. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. They made an appointment together to come to show him sympathy and comfort him. And when they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him. And they raised their voices and wept, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads toward heaven. And they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. First thing to notice is Job's friends' plan to come to comfort him. Okay, verse 11. Now the text here in this biography here, this little narrative, only lists the three original friends of Job. Okay, there's no mention of the fourth friend, Elihu, until you get to chapter 32. There's no mention of him. The first three are here, but Elihu's not mentioned here. So we don't know if Elihu came along with the rest of them and sat with Job like these three did. There's a possibility of that. I don't know. Doesn't really matter. But it's interesting that he's missing here. Now, other than their general ethnicity, we know very little about these men. We don't know how they knew Job. We don't know where they actually lived or how they knew each other or what they did, etc., etc., etc. We have very little information about them. What we're told, however, is each of them and their location. We know of the first, Eliphaz the Temanite. Teman was an important city in Edom, according to Genesis 36:11 and 15, and even later in Ezekiel 25:15. Now, you remember that Edom is the territory, the land to the southeast of the Dead Sea where Job was probably at. Uz is, according to Lamentations, in the territory of Edom. So he's probably living on what we would call the eastern side of the Dead Sea, although there's a good possibility it's not dead yet, because that doesn't come later in the discussion of Abraham's and Sodom and Gomorrah and so forth. So he's living in a fairly nice, lush area, probably to the southeast of the Dead Sea. Now, here's what's confusing, but not that confusing. Teman, the name of the city, was named for one of the sons of Eliphaz, this man. So, and he, by the way, was the firstborn of Esau. You remember Esau was the firstborn son of Jacob, who was passed over, firstborn son of Isaac that was passed over for Jacob, right? Okay. So Esau eventually became a people and a land, eventually, okay? So this man, Eliphaz, is not that son of Esau. Highly unlikely. It's possible, but it's highly unlikely. Rather, it's more likely that he is simply named for this ancestor. Okay? So probably some years before, when this area was settled, here we have a man named after him. Thus, it can be the only thing that really can be inferred about Eliphaz is that he was a close neighbor of Job. That's really the only thing we can infer, that he lived nearby. The second is Bildad the Shuhite. Shuhite means from Shua, S-H-U-A-H. Shua was a son of Abraham by a concubine named Keturah. You find this in Genesis chapter 25 and verse 2. So the best guess that we have is that Shua is somewhere either in Edom, same territory as the Temanites, or further east across into the Arabian Peninsula, somewhere in that territory, somewhere in there. So we know very little about what that really is about. So again, it's someplace near to Edom, but clearly further away than Eliphaz would have been, who would have been right in the same territory. So we're not really sure. It's our best guess. The third man is Zophar, the Naamathite. Now, Naamah was a sister of a man by the name of Tubal-Cain. Tubal-Cain was a descendant of Cain. After Cain was banished by God to wander the earth, he eventually had ancestors in Genesis chapter 4 and verse 22, an ancestor by the name of Tubal-Cain. And so Naamah was a sister of this man by the name of Tubal-Cain. The Kenites, as a people, were descendants of this Naamah, the sister of Tubal-Cain. And they are probably settling in the Midian wilderness southwest of Edom, according to Numbers chapter 10 and verse 29, implying that the Naamathites were occupants of the territory opposite of where the Shuhites would have lived. Shuhites being to the east, the Naamathites to the west, but probably not that far away from Edom in between, and so probably had some sort of connection in that sense. Further away from Edom than the previous two, but somehow connected. The very real possibility is that these men are all friends by trade, that they traded with one another along the trade routes that ran in that territory, but we don't know that. We have nothing that tells us who these men are, at least not in this chapter. There's some things we might intimate from other passages in their speeches, but again, all that speculation. So here we have these three men who come and they make a plan together. It says in verse 11 that they made an appointment together to come and show him sympathy. So they made a plan. They had heard of Job's plight, and they planned together to come and to comfort him, which would be, I think, on the surface at least, a thoughtful gesture. Okay, our friend Job is suffering. We're good friends, so let's go and see him. Let's go and see what's happening, see if we can bring him some comfort. So on the surface, that's a thoughtful gesture. But I want to remind you of something, and you need to, again, keep this in mind. Don't read back into this text what we know today. Try to put yourself in that time period. Given the locations and time frames of these men, their knowledge of the living God would have been negligible. Their knowledge of the living God would have been negligible. Remember, we're talking about somewhere between 2000 and 1500 BC as the likely time frame that these events occurred. I lean towards the lower end of that, around 1500, giving enough time for Abraham to have descendants and Esau's descendants to create a territory and so forth. Okay. So you're looking at around 1500 BC. When did the Israelites come out of Egypt? 1400 BC. Still 100 years in the future from my dating here. And even then, that's when the law is given. So what you have is you have nothing in terms of the revelation of God written. You have the natural law, of course, written on the heart of men, but you don't have any real knowledge of the living God in terms of revelation. You have massive amounts of general revelation, but no special revelation, no salvific or specific revelation given at this point. So these men are coming. Oh, and by the way, the locations that I just mentioned up above have a tendency to confirm that dating. So these men are not filled with the knowledge of Yahweh. They're not coming to talk to Job about God. Now they do. They do talk a great deal about God. But again, what's their understanding of God? Well, it's paper thin. Now, I might suggest to you that these men probably knew more about God than the typical evangelical does today, but that's just an opinion. And not really worth the paper it's written on. Get the pun? So it would appear as though God has seen fit to help Job by sending him men that are filled with wisdom and knowledge. However, here's what Calvin writes at this point in his sermons. He says this, quote, he says, as we will observe from their disputes immediately afterwards, meaning all of chapters 4 to 31, Job's three friends are perfect for the task of comforting Job. And now make sure you understand that Calvin is speaking sarcastically when he says that, okay? They're perfect for this task, okay? But we will see that his friend's visit was intended to aggravate his misery and plunge him to the depths of the abyss. Unquote. In other words, they're not coming here to bring Job comfort. They're actually thinking they're coming to bring comfort, but their comfort is used by Satan to drive Job into even further despair. They're agents of the devil. So I would make a very quick application of that. And you know what I'm going to say, right? Yeah, motives don't always accomplish what we think they will. Some of the greatest acts of wickedness ever done on this planet were done with good motives. So Job's friends arrive, verse 12. And it says they did not recognize him. The attack of Satan upon Job had left him disfigured physically. And when you add to that the emotional and spiritual stress that the man is suffering under, his circumstances make that picture all the worse. He's not just suffering of the sores he has on his flesh. Okay, we have a tendency to want to dismiss everything else that's already happened, but we have to think about where Job is at, right? Here's a man sitting on a pile of ashes, scraping himself with a piece of broken pottery because he has these sores that itch terribly on his flesh. But he's also realizing, yeah, I've lost all my children. All these 7 sons and 3 daughters that I was trying to bring up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, they're all gone. All of my wealth is gone. I mean, all of my even means of support is gone. All of my animals are gone. And my wife, she ain't much of a help. So there's a great deal of emotional stress there, isn't it? But I would ask you to layer even on top of that another layer, and that is not only is Job suffering physically in his flesh and the emotional realities of loss, but he's also dealing with, naturally, the questions. And those questions all begin with, why? Why me, oh God? What does this mean? How do I understand this? None of that, by the way, is sinful. Right? None of that is sinful. We'll come back to that in a second. But the point is that he's suffering in so many different ways in this moment. And when they come around the corner and they see him sitting on the ash heap, they're like, man, he looks bad. You can almost see in this text that the visitors were expecting something else, weren't they? You can kind of read the text. It's like they were expecting something else. The reports that had come to them about his condition were vastly understated, I would think. They show up to this guy who is in massive physical, emotional, and spiritual depression and physical suffering, and he's dealing with these realities. Now, let's probe that issue of the spiritual suffering of Job for a moment. Okay. Now, I am convinced that him sitting there and asking questions is not sinful. Okay, it's not. It's not sinful. He's asking deep theological questions. Why? Why are these things true? Why has this happened? What might I learn from this? What might be the reality of this? Who is God in the face of all these? These are kinds of questions that would naturally come out of us, but they're not necessarily sinful. I give you two examples to make my case. When Jesus is in the garden praying, what does he ask? If there's any other way that this cup might pass. Was that a sinful question? Obviously not. And yet it was a reasonable question, wasn't it? I'm about to go to a cross, which Jesus would have been very familiar with what crucifixion is all about. And so he knows what the reality is he's about to suffer, not only the fact that he's going to suffer physically, but he's also going to suffer spiritually and emotionally, just like Job is, right? And so he's asking a legitimate question. Is there any other way that this can pass? It's not a sinful question to ask that question. It's not sinful when in chapter 27 and verse 46 he cries out from the cross, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? It's a reasonable question of a man who is in the midst of pain and suffering. You see, we must be careful that we do not assert that all questionings of God are sinful. The Bible is filled with people questioning God. It becomes sinful when we begin to draw conclusions that are inconsistent with Scripture. That's where it becomes sinful. When we start drawing assertions and making assertions about the nature of God. But asking the questions are not in themselves sinful. So here's poor Job sitting on a pile of ash, scraping himself and struggling with these things. And they respond by raising their voices and weeping, tearing their robes, and sprinkling dust on their heads towards heaven. What did they do? They grieved. This is the ancient Semitic response to news of great grief. This is what you do. You tear your robes, you sprinkle dust on your head, you weep. That's what grieving men do. They saw what Job had experienced. In a sense, you might almost say that they look at Job and they see him as dead. And they grieve over him. This response is also the response that one makes to a blasphemous statement. Meaning something that causes you great grief because you hear something that's clearly against the nature of God. You see examples of this in Mark 14, 61 to 63, when the high priest responds to Jesus' remarks. When Jesus declares himself to be the one who will be coming in the clouds. And they tear their robes and they throw dust in the air. Oh, you blasphemer, you. It's a picture of grief. In fact, this entire thing of them sitting with Job for 7 days and not speaking is very similar to Ezekiel's response to the exiles in Babylon at Tel Abib in Ezekiel 3:15, when he sits for 7 days with them, mourning. And why is he mourning? He's mourning over what they have lost in abandoning their God and being exiled away into Babylon. For all practical purposes, Ezekiel sits there and mourns over the fact that these people are dead. They're alive physically, but they're spiritually broken and separated and sent away from God. In other words, these men come and they see something in Job that causes them to grieve, not only for the losses that he had experienced, but for the terrible reality that he is now enduring, which will explain much of their comfort later. But hold that thought. So in verse 13, then, they sit with him. It says that they sat with him for 7 days and no one spoke a word. Okay, you want to give that a try? Anybody? Okay, go home and sit and don't say a word for 7 days. Just sit there. Even though you really want to say something. Okay? But they sat there. They waited for him to speak first. They waited for him to speak first, which is exactly what will happen. Chapter 3, he speaks. They sat and they waited for him. Now, I will grant them this, okay? As I know, Calvin called them, harbingers of wickedness that are about to come and make his life miserable. But hey, at least at the beginning, they get something right, okay? And here's what they get right. They understood the idea of not just bringing platitudes or rash responses to Joe. You know what a platitude is, right? Just a quick little saying designed to try to make comfort that really doesn't have any substance to it. It's this, okay, it's this. Somebody is in the midst of grief and your first reaction, and you can't help yourself, right? Your first reaction is there anything I can do? And in the back of your mind, you're going, please don't say yes to that question. It's a platitude. They recognize, at least, don't bring a platitude. Okay, so here's, as I was reading that and I thought about this, something clicked in my head. Here's what clicked. And again, I'm a little weird, so the clicking sound may not be all that good. But okay, here's what I'm thinking about. Sometimes the best response to the emotional or spiritual circumstances or needs of someone else from within a biblical worldview, is simply to wait and think it through. Sometimes the best response is to say nothing and just think it through. Social media is designed to elicit response, is it not? Everything you post on social media, you are doing so for one reason only. And what is that reason? You want someone to respond, don't you? That's the whole point of it. I'm absolutely right on this. You can't argue me out of it. I'm right. Because you see, even if you don't respond by pressing like or pressing a share or making an actual typed response, you are responding. You do. Oh, what a pretty kitty that is. Or, oh, that's wonderful. They went to Florida for their vacation. Isn't that nice? Hey, that's a pretty nice hotel they're staying in. You respond. Every single thing someone posts on social media is to get someone to respond. Now, you would much more like it if they would push like, right? And you would really like it if they would actually share that with somebody else, or if they would type a response below it, right? The whole point of social media is to elicit responses. And I would argue that it's built on the supposition that people want to respond quickly to things. It's built on the idea of quickly getting a response. How do you garner likes, right? You put up something that gets big responses, and a whole lot of people respond just like that. It's the point of this thing. And it's true even when the full story hasn't really been revealed, right? Somebody posts something and it's not, we don't know all the details yet, but there it is. And we respond to it. We respond often without stopping to consider what we are seeing. So often we see somebody go, oh, that's nice. Hey, that's good for you, right? We immediately seem to respond. Social media is built along that line. It's what it wants. We get a meme, and we quickly look at it and go, oh, yeah, I agree with that. And then you stop and think about it for a while and go, ooh, no, that's bad theology there. But we've already pressed like, and it's too late. Or we get stories that are myths sent to us. Somebody sends us a story about something, and later we discovered that all the facts haven't really come out, and the story actually turns out to be untrue, but we've already responded to it, and we've already shared it with 16 of our friends, etc., etc., etc. But this reminds me, and this is what clicked in my head, this reminds me of the response of the fool in Proverbs 18. In Proverbs 18, there are 5 different responses of the fool that are given. 18, 2, 4, 6, 13, and 17. And here's what the proverb writer writes. Quote, "A fool takes no pleasure in understanding, but only in expressing his opinion. Now, if that doesn't apply to social media, I don't know what does. The words of a man's mouth are deep waters. The fountain of wisdom is a bubbling brook. Now, okay, that isn't being said as a positive thing. It's actually being said in jest. A fool's lips walk into a fight, and his mouth invites a beating. If one gives an answer before he hears, it is his folly and shame. In other words, until he's heard the whole story, if he's already opened his mouth and talked, it becomes his folly and his shame. And then the last one, the one who states his case first seems right until the other comes and examines him. This is the distinction between the fool and the wise. The fool rushes in. The fool opens his mouth and starts talking. He begins to respond immediately. These aren't in my outline because I thought of them in the shower yesterday. That is exactly the reason why evil is in this world. A woman stood at a tree. Satan came along and engaged her, and her response should have been, excuse me, let me think about that for a minute. Let me stop and consider what you're saying. Did God really say that we should eat from all the... Wait. Hang on. Let me have a minute to confer with my husband about that. But what did she do? She didn't do that. She just responds immediately. And she throws open the door for him to make a second comment to her, which becomes a flat-out lie, and she believes it, and here we go. The reason why the world is filled with evil as it is because someone didn't stop and take a moment and consider what was being said before they responded to it. And the counterexample to that is found twice in the gospel accounts. Jesus is standing before the Sanhedrin, and they're berating him and yelling at him and accusing him of all sorts of things, and he doesn't say a word. And it's making him mad. Until he finally does speak. And when he does, he brings forth great wisdom. And they tear their robes and rush at him because he spoke truth. And exactly the same thing just a little while later when Jesus is standing in front of Pilate. And Pilate's asking him questions. Why will you not defend yourself? He doesn't say a word until Pilate asks him just the right question, and then Jesus says what he says. Notice, he thinks before he responds. He takes a moment to think about it. If Eve would have taken a moment to think about what was being said by the devil, we might not be in this soup. These men, I will grant them, came, sat, didn't say a word. Let's let him speak first. Okay, so I will give them at least some benefit of the doubt. But the lesson for us is that sometimes the best response to evil, sometimes the best response to something that comes at us, is to pause and consider everything, particularly from a scriptural perspective, before we start offering advice or platitudes. Sometimes it's best. Wait. Think about what's happening here. When evil comes upon us, when something happens to us that's wicked, our immediate reaction is to want to respond to that. I want to say something. I got something I got to say. I want to do something. It was one of the hardest lessons I ever learned being a married man. My wife doesn't always want me to get out the toolbox and fix something. Sometimes she just wants me to shut up and listen. Take that advice, guys. This is a biblical concept. When God speaks, he speaks out of deep knowledge. He speaks out of infinite understanding. And so when he speaks, the words that come out of his mouth are true. We don't have that. And our minds, hearts, worlds are corrupted. And a lot of the time, our thinking isn't always along the lines of what the Bible actually says. And so it is wise for us to stop and think about it. Maybe the best approach sometimes is just to sit with those who suffer and consider things for a while. Maybe we don't need to bring platitudes or quick bits of advice. Maybe we just need to sit and think. So that leaves me with a final question as we close. What is Job thinking about? What's on his mind? And the answer to that is found in chapter 3, which, Lord willing, we will get to after you spend a week thinking about it.